Alright guys, Murph's here. And as you can see, I've still not yet made it back to my normal reviewing couch. However, rest assured, eventually that will happen, but for now, we are going to have to bear with some less than optimal surroundings in order for me to bring some content to you guys that I normally wouldn't have full access to like I do right now. So, with that being the case, let's go ahead and roll into today's review, which is on this, a Sig M17 chambered in 9mm. Now, when we're talking about this pistol, we're going to have to talk about a little bit of history. Now, over the last more than a decade, probably roughly 14, 15 years, I was reading quite a few articles that was talking about the military wanting to change out their service pistol. The venerable Beretta M9 had been in service since the mid-1980s and was starting to hit the end of its service life. A lot of the pistols were very beat up and just, everything's got its point where it's going to fail. So, the military, and the Army specifically, was entertaining new opportunities to be able to upgrade to something more modern and new. Now, not to say that there's anything wrong with double-action, single-action handguns, other than to say that the Beretta was indicative of high technology for a time that had now passed. In the time that the Beretta had been more or less the mainstay of military service, polymer-framed, striker-fired Wonder 9s had become the new standard, and the vast majority of government and police agencies had switched over to them. So the Army decided to start going ahead and taking a look at doing the same. Now, the Army was not alone in this. The Air Force and the Marine Corps had an interest as well, and of course, where those go, the Navy is inevitably going to follow. Now, in 2015, the government would get serious about it and would launch the MHS trials. Now, MHS meaning Modular Handgun System. And all the big name manufacturers would present their handguns in order to be able to net this very lucrative contract. Now, the trials would go on for a little while, and finally it would be narrowed down to two guns to proceed to the next level of testing, which would be the Glock 19X and SIG's P320. Now, for those of you with a long memory, you might notice that the P320 resembles another handgun out of the SIG lineup, one that has kind of faded into the background, and that is the SIG P250. Now, the P250 was a double-action only polymer-framed handgun that had a interchangeable chassis system. That was the serialized part, and it could be changed into other grip modules if you so sought. Now, unfortunately, the P250 was not a very popular product because, as it turns out, no one was really interested in double-action only pistols, and it kind of faded into anonymity along with such SIG products as the SIG P290. I remember at one point SIG P250s were incredibly cheap to pick up, and at the time I was considering it because a 9mm high-capacity handgun, or I guess you could say standard capacity handgun, was very interesting to me. I didn't have anything at that capacity of 15 or more rounds in my arsenal at the time. But I did not wind up getting a hold of one. Now, in January of 2017, it would be announced that SIG had won the contract, and this caused a lot of speculation and surprise on a lot of people's behalf because the Glock was more or less standard for a wide number of government agencies, law enforcement agencies, and militaries all across the world. So there was quite a bit of speculation as to what caused this kind of upheaval, this upset, if you will. And let's go ahead and dive into a couple of things, because I've heard some kind of ridiculous theories and I have some of my own to present. Now, first off, a lot of people like to point out that the Glocks do not have thumb safeties, and that was a requirement in the modular handgun trials. However, something that I would point out that though the Glock 19X that is available on the civilian market does not have a manual safety, the one that was presented for military trials did. So that's probably not the reason that Glock did not win in this case. Now, the next theory that gets thrown out there is that the Glock was just one handgun design, whereas the military was looking to fulfill an M17 and M18, which was supposed to be a compact handgun. But that doesn't necessarily hold very much water either, because it was suitable that... Sorry, the range just went hot, so we'll try to power through it. Let's see, where was I? The Glock entry satisfied this requirement by having the Glock 19 slide with a Glock 17 frame. And this was not the only handgun to go this route. The FN509 would be indicative of the same type of thinking. That handgun's actually a little diminutive for how it gets pressed into service. Not to say that it's super small, just to say that it has some kind of odd dimensions to it. Apparently, that was completely fine because Glock made it to the second round of trials where a lot of other handguns did not. And then the third thing a lot of people like to say is that the Glock is not as modular or did not meet the modularity requirements as the M7 or the Sig P320 did. And this I don't entirely agree with it either. Now, to say that it's not as modular, that holds a little bit of water, and we'll get into that here in a second. But to say that it's not modular at all is not accurate. Modularity is just a matter of the end user being able to configure it to their needs. And with the backstrap system that Generation 4 and on Glocks utilize, that meets the modularity requirement. And yet again, it made it to the second round of trials, so clearly it was doing something right. Now, it may not necessarily have the removable chassis that the Sig P320 does as a hanger-on from the days of the P250, but it is still modular at its core, because the same overall process here is just you remove the chassis and then you swap in whatever grip frame it is that you need at that particular time. Now, someone might point out that, well, the government makes a lot of like weird choices and there's bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff, and I dislike that argument because though it's accurate, it's also kind of a scapegoat for not actually having to justify why it is that you think this particular product should have been a choice over another. What I really think it came down to was price. When Glock and Sig had their closed-door meetings in order to be able to establish what the overall package would look like, the number of handguns, maintenance plans, all that type of stuff, Sig came in at a lower price point. And if you want to talk about government bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff, it boils down to money. Now, the fact that interchangeable chassis does allow you to at least order cheaper frames so that you can swap those out should they become damaged, or you can turn an M17 into an M18 and that has a practicality associated with it. Yes, that is a minutia type aspect of going with something that has a chassis system. Also, you could make an argument that this allows the handgun to be able to grow with the military requirements. Should something change, they can take this chassis out, put it into another grip frame or module or slide combination that makes this thing work better for its applications. At the end of the day, that's what the government wound up going with. Now, Glock would appeal, which is a frequent occurrence whenever there are weapons trials. I'm pretty sure that whenever they come out of the board meeting that made that decision, they've already got the appeal packet ready to go, and all the manufacturers have to do is sign it in order to be able to start the appeals process. But it was to no avail. Glock still did not win the contract, and the Sig P320 became the M17. Now, a couple things about these. Initially, they would come out with these black controls and all that kind of stuff. As I understand it now, Sig has been switching over to everything being a uniform, kind of this tan, brown type of coloration that we have going on here. Feel free to correct me in the comments if that's the case. All I know is what it is that I have on this particular pistol. Now, when it comes to proliferation of the M17 outside of the government, quite a few of the contract or the test guns, the trials guns, were released for sale in the civilian market, and their prices quickly skyrocketed because there's an interest in having the guns before they become surplused out, like full-on surplus out, like these M9s eventually will be. Now, in addition to that, you also have an M17 commemorative that Sig has been producing small batches of, and then also there's the Sig P320 M17, which really only differs from the standard product in that you can get it in black, and then also it has P320 markings next to the M17 on the slide. All right, guys, I think that pretty much sums up history. So why don't we go ahead and go into the features of this particular pistol. Now, right off the bat, we have a 4.7-inch barrel that does utilize a Browning tilting cam system. We have steel tritium night sights, which are a green front sight and an orange rear sight. This is actually kind of nice as far as there's no possibility that anybody in a low light situation could potentially confuse which set of dots is their front sight and their rear sight. I have never necessarily considered that to be a real, like a viable possibility, but it is something that has been brought up in different types of low light training scenarios, and I admittedly have maybe not as much training as I should in low light shooting situations with handguns. Now, we have this PVD coating on the slide, this kind of like peanut butter appearance going, and when it comes to military contracts right now, pretty much everything's going to this coloration because we've been fighting in the desert for 20 years, and now we decided that we actually want our weapon systems to be able to blend into it. Now, you'll also note that on the front, we have these front cocking serrations. This has been a source of a lot of discussion on the internet. A lot of people are not necessarily convinced that any superiority, inherent superiority in forward cocking serrations, and a lot of it comes down to conducting press checks. right? Which is also a very hot topic on the civilian market. Now, forward cocking serrations, as long as they don't necessarily add cost, I don't really get broken up one way or the other in talking about forward cocking serrations. If it doesn't necessarily add any money, you don't have to use them if you don't want to. Now, when it comes to press checks, I have quite a variety of handguns that I train with, and not all of them have excellent loaded chamber indicators that are both visible and tactile. So I have a tendency to default to doing press checks on my handguns. So I actually get a little bit of use out of front cocking serrations, but that doesn't mean that I can't use rear cocking serrations to do the same. So I am indifferent on discussions when it comes to front cocking serrations. Now, coming back to our chamber, this is of course a 9mm chambered handgun. We have conventional rifling in the barrel, and what I find very interesting is that we also have a loaded chamber indicator, which was a requirement. You can see it right there, a little nubbin coming out of the top of the breech, which was a requirement of the modular handgun system trials. Now, this is actually an excellent loaded chamber indicator because it is very tactile. It prominently stands off the slide, not so much that it would necessarily catch on things, but it's very easy to run your finger across it and feel that loaded chamber indicator. And we also have a port cut into the chamber to be able to view brass if we're in a visibility situation where we can actually see that. I consider this a much better loaded chamber indicator than what you get on Glocks. Glocks have a loaded chamber indicator, which is a small protrusion off of the extractor. However, I find that very difficult to pick up in low light situations and have never been a fan of relying on that. I would prefer to do a press check and then reach into the chamber in order to be able to feel whether or not I have brass in there. And ultimately, when it comes to press check, guys, or when it comes to checking your chamber, because again, a lot of people like to debate this overall subject, the sound of your gun coming up on target and having a click, not a boom, is deafening. So it's worthwhile before rolling out on the job or shooting, competition or whatever drill to check your chamber, because everyone's had it happen. I've had it happen plenty of times. You're pretty sure there's a round in the chamber, and then you draw, and it turns out you never racked the slide. All right, now coming back to our rear sight. Now, our rear sight is actually quite wide, which is one of the things that I dislike about this pistol, because it has a tendency to kind of obscure targets and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like it's unnecessarily wide, that they could have actually made this a little bit more diminutive. You can kind of see there how wide it is. Made this a little bit more diminutive. They're still going to be very stout if you have to rack it off a boot or a table or something along those lines. And you would still be able to see more of your target as you're lining up on whatever system. Now, something else to keep in mind when it comes to the Glock 19X, it also had steel night sights. That was a requirement of the modular handgun system. Now, another requirement was that these guns be optics cut, which this pistol is actually cut for the Leupold Delta Point Pro. Now, something to keep in mind is that when you mount the Delta Point Pro, you will lose your rear sight, and that's fine in the case of the Delta Point Pro because it has a rear sight built in, but that isn't necessarily the best option when you have a standard size front sight. So I kind of consider that a little bit of a miss, and something that if I were to mount an optic on here, I would immediately swap out this front sight for a suppressor height front sight. Of course, we have very grippy rear cocking serrations. It's a pretty good design there overall. Now, coming down to our frame here, we have a railed dust cover, which is fantastic for lights and all that kind of stuff. I presently do not run a light on this pistol. However, that is a future upgrade that I'm considering, but I'll also have to upgrade holsters when I do that. My employer has not provided me a light, so I have not been in a rush to put one on the pistol, though I have run into situations where I wish I had one. Now, on this side, we have our disassembly lever, which also is integral in being able to remove the chassis system, which we can see right there. All that stainless steel, which is a little dirty, I do need to clean this, that is all a part of the chassis system. Now, we do have ambidextrous slide releases, as you can see here. And then we also have an ambidextrous thumb safety. We have a pretty good beaver tail, which I do appreciate in order to be able to kind of press that into my grip and help stabilize the pistol. I do like that quite a bit. Now the triggers. The triggers are a very interesting aspect to talk about with SIG P320s in general, and there's a couple things we need to talk about with the M17 specifically. Now, shortly after the Army got the contract for the P320 becoming the M17, there came out that the P320 was not drop safe. And this was a big discussion for a little while. There's a couple things that we didn't talk about. So the issue was that the pistol was dropped and landed in a certain orientation. The trigger, through the forces of inertia, would continue to travel and would cause the handgun to discharge. Now that's very concerning. Now one of the key things here is don't drop your gun. However, if you're a police officer or LE or military in certain situations, you could wind up in a struggle for your firearm in which it gets out of your hands and hits the ground, and it would definitely be unfortunate to be shot with your own gun. Now, SIG would address this issue and would also go to these, and they would address the issue. Excuse me, that was the magazine. Here, got a pocket for that. Why don't I use it? The SIG would address that in the P320s, and then with the military M17 already having a thumb safety on it, it wasn't necessarily as big of an issue for this particular handgun. Now, I've known some guys who do not care to keep the weapon on safe because the SIG does still technically have passive trigger type safeties incorporated into it, but not having the trigger dingus like you see on Glocks or Smith & Wessons and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't have a positive block from keeping the trigger moving, which is why on the M17 specifically, I prefer to run the thumb safety. Now, in addition to that, anytime you hand me a handgun that has a manual safety, I will generally train around using that manual safety, because the worst case I can think of is pulling this gun from the holster to engage a threat and having the safety somehow having been knocked on and not being able to fire the gun when I want to. That's a problem for me. So I train around safeties. I train around making sure I turn safeties off in order to have the gun go bang when it is that I want it to. Now, on this handgun specifically, I am less than impressed with the trigger overall in comparison to your standard P320. The standard P320 has a much better trigger than this particular handgun does. I noticed that this one kind of has a lot of creep and it's a little stagey. So it's not necessarily my favorite trigger that I've ever tried out, but it is workable. I'm not necessarily a trigger snob by any means, but it is something that I've definitely noticed in this handgun, especially in training with other people. Now, ultimately, it's a striker-fired handgun. You get a very consistent release point and all that kind of stuff. It's not like trying to train around a double-action, single-action gun like the M9, so that does kind of mitigate a lot of the training issues that you run into with training large numbers of people who are not necessarily gun savvy on handguns. Now, our magazine release located right here, and I do have to adjust my grip just a little bit in order to be able to hit the magazine release. Now, this is a reversible magazine release in keeping with this being an ambidextrous friendly gun. Now, our grip modules. This is a medium grip module. This also comes in a large and a small, and then you could move this over into an M18 with a lot of the same options, just a shorter overall frame. Now, something that I've noticed about this grip module is that the grip itself is kind of narrow, which is not necessarily my favorite. I've found that I've had to adjust my grip a little bit whenever it is that I'm shooting it in comparison to other handguns that I train with, but it is something that I've managed to be able to work around. As far as texture is concerned, I do not consider this to be a terribly grippy firearm, as is kind of indicative of a lot of commercial off-the-shelf guns. There's not a lot of grip up here, which is one of the areas that I actually would really like some texture. And this is why you frequently see people stifle the grips of a lot of different polymer handguns. Now, our magazine well is not necessarily flared. However, I've not found an issue, for the most part, being able to index and hit the magazine well. And I think a lot of that has to do with the design of these magazines. They do have a pretty decent taper, which makes it very easy to funnel into the magazine well. Now, as far as magazines are concerned, these come with a 17-round magazine and then also 21-round magazines. Now, something I will say for these 21-round mags is that it's very difficult to get all 21 rounds in, and I generally only load them to about 20, because that's still a pretty significant amount of ammunition on hand. All right, so, having some issue getting this magazine put up. All right, so, that's features. How does it shoot? Well, guys, I've had an interesting experience shooting this gun. Something that I've noticed consistently with SIGs is that when they cycle, they have a very weird travel, I guess is the best way to put it. So it's like the gun starts to cycle, kind of catches, there's like a noticeable pause, and then it runs the rest of the way through. And you can kind of hear that in the cycling. Like brakes, and then it travels. And that's how it feels whenever the gun cycles, and it's a little off-putting at first. But I have been able to work through it, and I've been able to pull off surprisingly good hits on small targets at greater than normal distances. I have no real accuracy complaints with this handgun, as much as I do have some just kind of weird ergonomic shooting complaints that just come from primarily training and owning Glocks. I'm a Glock guy. I like Glock handguns. I shoot them a lot, and this is very much so a departure from your standard Glock. However, it's not something that has kept me from being able to shoot this handgun well. Surprisingly well. It surprises me every time. Sometimes whenever I break the shot, I'm like, I don't think that quite did what I wanted, but I've got to keep going with what it is that I'm doing. And then I go down and inspect the target, and it turns out I hit everything exactly how I planned. So the gun can do exactly what it is that you need it to do when it is that you need it to do it. All right, so recommendations. What are my recommendations when it comes to the M17 or Sig P320s in general? Now, my own biases aside, what I 100% believe is that you cannot mess up when it comes to polymer frame striker-fired handguns. As much as I might have my own preferences, my preferences are not necessarily your problem. So if you like how the P320 feels in your hand, or specifically the M17, then go for it, absolutely. There's no problem with that, whatever it is that makes you happy. If you handle this and you go, maybe a Smith & Wesson or a Glock would better fit my hand, then go for that. It's very much so an individual basis type thing. Ultimately, the handgun's been reliable, the handgun has been accurate, the handgun has done everything that I needed it to do, and I would expect it to be able to do the same for you. Now, what about my uses? Well, this is my duty pistol, so I have trained a fair amount around this particular handgun and have become very comfortable with it overall. Now, holster-wise, what I run with this is the Safariland ALS, set up pretty much how you see it here. And I absolutely love this holster. I find the opening very easy to hit whenever it comes to reholstering, and this is a level 3 retention holster, which I have the strap here which I seldom use. And then I also have the thumb release right here, which is very easy as I build my grip to be able to draw the pistol, to release, to hit that thumb release, and then get into whatever work it is that I need to get into. Big fan. If you haven't tried out these holsters, they are well worth the hype. All right, guys. That's pretty much my thoughts on this particular pistol. I hope you guys found this interesting, and have a good day.